My name is Chris, and I had a near-death experience on April 29th, 2012, and that's when my journey started. My NDE was caused from an anaphylactic reaction to a food allergy, specifically a peanut. I was at a friend's birthday party on a Sunday night, and the cake had peanuts in it, which I didn't know. It was an accident. I had a slice of the cake. I immediately spit the cake out, but obviously not all of it, and ingested a very small amount of the peanut. In that moment, I didn't think much of it. I never had a significant reaction prior to that in my life. I always knew I had an allergy. I very loosely kept EpiPens around. Most of the times they were expired. But in that time, it was never a concern. I did not know really what anaphylaxis was and what the effect could be on me having that. But looking back almost 11 and a half years later, there's so much you don't remember. And then those little moments you remember, and those pivotal little moments, and a second here, a second there, a thought here, a thought there, has these unbelievable consequences years down the road. And it all started that one night, in that simple second, taking a bite of that cake, and then the decisions I made in the next few hours, days, weeks, months, and years later. It's been quite a journey. So going back to that night, even though it's been 11 and a half years ago, I completely remember the moment I ingested that piece of cake, just a smidge on the fork, and I knew something was wrong. And I didn't have an initial reaction right away. I was actually quite okay, more just panicked. Like, oh, I think there was a peanut in there. Probably going to have to take some extra Benadryl, get to bed, and I'll be fine the next morning. And as time went on later that night, I realized I was having trouble sleeping, and I was feeling warm. And I was, in those moments, you think, or you can't really put together what could happen or what is happening. And are you overreacting? Are you underreacting? You don't really know. And I remember laying in bed at night thinking, okay, like, is this going to get better? Do I need more Benadryl? Do I not? What's going to happen? Let me lay here for another hour, see what happens, and we'll go from there. Maybe I'll call the hospital, call 911, or we don't, we deal with it and just take more Benadryl and sleep it off. And after a couple hours of that, I realized my breathing was becoming more labored. I got up, I looked in the mirror, I was covered in hives. I had a rash all over my body. I was breaking out. And I went from being, all right, this is discomfort, to this is becoming a concern very quickly at that point. And this was a few hours after when I initially consumed the allergen, the peanut. And there's so many moments looking back, like I said earlier, where you make decisions and you don't know what the ramifications are, but you make the best decision you can in that moment. And I thought to myself, what do I do here? Do I call 911? Do I use this EpiPen that I have here, but it's expired? And does the EpiPen going to work? Do I know how to even properly use it? Should I go to the hospital? Should I drive myself to the hospital? It's a Sunday evening. There's no traffic. And in that moment, I made the decision to drive myself to the hospital. And I remember getting in the car and driving with the EpiPen on the passenger seat next to me, and just focusing on breathing as much as I could. My breathing was getting so difficult. It was so hard to breathe. And I knew at that point, I knew what was happening. I knew I was slowly suffocating while driving myself to the hospital. And I thought, let me just get there. One more light. Give me a few more minutes. It's all I need. Let me stretch this time. Just focus on breathing. Focus on breathing. And I'm thinking that. And I'm also thinking, how can I let this happen? This is so insane that this is happening right now. But just get to the hospital. Get there. They can deal with this. And fortunately, it was a Sunday night and there was no traffic. And I was able to get there in record time. And every second, every minute counted. And when I get there, I remember pulling up and stumbling out of the car right at the emergency room, walking into the front desk at the ER and presenting my wallet at the desk. And because they asked for identification, I'm trying to grab my ID out of my wallet. And I remember I didn't even have the motor function to pull the ID out of the little slits in the wallet. And I fell into the desk, and I said, I'm having an allergic reaction. And I remember they jumped up and they grabbed me, and they immediately brought me back into the operating area. I was laying on the bed. I had all these doctors and nurses around me, and I it gets very fuzzy at this point because the pain was starting to subside. I knew laying on that bed that I was dying. And the moments are so clear and so vivid. And then there's rest that you just don't put together having a near-death experience. But there's some vivid moments that I can feel like I'm still there now, 11 and a half years later. That emotion, that feeling, that energy is still with me, and it's still there, and it's clear as day. And I remember laying there and just thinking, like, oh my God, this is what dying is. I feel like I'm dying. I know I'm dying because I was able to still function mentally, but I knew I was slipping away and I wasn't able to breathe. I laid there breathing and they were working around me, trying to give me Benadryl was going into my wrist. Epinephrine was coming in through my shoulder. I was on oxygen. They were trying to stop the anaphylactic reaction that was taking place and open up my airway. And I remember the ER doctor opening my mouth, holding my mouth open, trying to speak to me. And I'm not verbal at this point. I'm just laying there and I'm thinking, why is everyone running around? I have this euphoric feeling over me, and I'm laying there, and not that I wanted to die by any means, but just that there was this sense of acceptance and that it was just this show going on around me. I was stepping out of myself while all this was happening, and they were going to put a tube down my throat, and because the anaphylactic reaction was not stopping with the epinephrine, and they were running out of options. And I didn't feel anything after a while. I was in this absolute euphoric bliss, and I use that to describe this. And language is very limiting with any near-death experience, or even in the NDE community. Having the right language, we don't have the right language for these stories and for the experience of what was going on. And here I am struggling to breathe, suffocating in this moment, yet in this euphoric bliss, and realizing to myself the idea that, material things don't matter, only love matters. Realizing, acknowledging that I was dying and it was okay. I'm like, I'm dying. I knew I was dying. And it wasn't a scary feeling. It wasn't even a bizarre feeling. It was just kind of an acceptance. Not that I wanted to. I want to be very clear on that, but it was just kind of oh, it's happening. And like, okay. And I remember being in that moment. And while in that moment, I don't want to use the word visited, but I was surrounded with my grandfathers. One passed away in the 1960s and one passed away in the early 90s when I was several years old. And they were both with me. And I knew it was them, whether by their energy, but it was just them. I was with them in that moment. And my one grandfather says, you can't die. You have work to do. And in that moment, I'm always asked, what did that mean? Work to do or anything like that. And still to this day, 11 and a half years later, I never got a full answer on that. But I remember thinking, okay, I'm having this almost while having my near-death experience. And in that moment of that euphoric bliss and realizing I was dying, I was visited, or I was with my deceased grandfathers. And this is where language becomes very limiting, because they say, oh, well, how are you communicating? It was, the only thing I can possibly relate to was a telepathic wave of communication that kind of came over me. And in that moment, the message was very clear. You can't die. You have work to do. And I remember hearing that. And in that moment, I thought to myself, okay, I don't want to die. Because up until then, I wasn't fighting. The near death. I fought to get to the hospital. I fought to breathe. I fought to get into the emergency room. I fought and made decisions the best I could throughout that night to survive. And when I was in there, I just accepted whatever it was, because it was a euphoric feeling. And I was there. I made it to the hospital. But I knew I was dying. And from that moment of my grandfather saying, you can't die, you have work to do, I realized that I didn't want to die. And I remember then saying, no, I don't want to die. No, I don't. I want to go back. And in that moment, the most I can liken it to is I shot back in my body. I went back in. I instantly felt pain. I instantly felt the emotion. I felt the frantic, the panic, the chaos in the room, the pain, the trauma, the intensity around me, all that was non-existent leading up to this moment. And then once I said that, I was back in my body, and I remember fighting and scraping to breathe and clawing at the mask that was on me. They had the oxygen mask on me. And all of that was going on, scraping for breath, scraping, trying to survive is the only thing I can liken it to in that moment. And that's when I started to become more responsive with the ER staff. And and I started to stabilize. I started to slowly come out of it. I was responsive. My body was recovering. I was coming back. Physically, I was coming back. Mentally, I was coming back. I was coming back as myself, of realizing what was even going on in this moment. Wow. Hours went by being in the hospital room, laying there, recovering. And I spoke to the nurse and I said, again, at this point, there was no concept of near death. Oh my God, what happened? It was just, this was an intense traumatic event. How bad was it? The nurse said on a scale of 1 to 10, 9.5, 10, we thought we lost you. You were gone. It's a miracle you survived. It's a miracle you're here. It's a miracle you're even functioning and speaking. You were suffocating. We could not stop the anaphylactic. And I only thought about 40 minutes went by, and it was actually about 8 hours. And the staff said I was unrecognizable from the moment I walked in to the moment I walked out. So I actually left the hospital about 8.5, 9 hours later from the moment I walked in. So the actual near-death experience was really only several minutes. The journey of the NDE is still going on 11.5 years later. I had no idea what a near-death experience was. I had no idea what even happened. I was in so much physical pain for about a week afterwards. There was no thought of anything spiritual or emotional. It was just the pain to even just breathe and having my body function. I remember very clearly. And I was very fortunate. I've always journaled. So since I was about 14, so probably about 10 years prior to that, I've always kept a journal. So I was journaling this entire time, and things were changing. My emotions were different. I woke up every single day with a consciousness I didn't know. I didn't know who I was each and every day for probably 6 to 8 months. And I wrote, and I look back years later now, that I said my consciousness has shifted. And again, there was no concept of a near-death experience. I had no idea what happened. I just know I had an anaphylactic reaction to a food allergy, and now my senses are off. My energy is off. My thought process is off. My emotions are off. Everything I think, believe, see, understand is now changing. I don't really know myself from what happened. And then you start to piece in what happened. Oh my God, I had this experience. I was with my deceased loved ones. What is this? Is this something that happens? What went on? Was this just because of the chemicals that were being pumped through me? And what happened? What's this mean? Oh my God, I remember this moment. I remember that moment. And then I was very fortunate. I don't even know how this happened, but like about 2 months later, I stumbled across some literature on near-death experience. And I took one of those goofy tests, and it was like I had like 29 out of the 30 traits of a near-death experience. And I reached out to them, and I connected with someone that's been in that field for many decades. That's still a very, very close friend of mine to this day. And I explained my story to her, and she goes, "Oh, honey, you had a near-death experience." I said, "Well, I have no idea what's going on. So let's unpack this together." And that really, at that moment, it really started the journey of what a near-death as a near-death experiencer, what a near-death experience really is. It's, on an entire scale of 1 to 100, the NDE is really only, 1 to 3%. The rest is the lifetime and the journey after a near-death experience. That's really the entire story, I feel, speaking from experience. And I went on this path of self-discovery and journey and healing and integration and figuring out what happened, what I'm doing, and reintegrating and building myself with my new consciousness. And I had my NDE at 23, 24 years old. So I was starting adulthood. I was starting career. And then on top of that, you have a near-death experience. So anything you thought, you believed, you wanted, you had this feeling, you had a way you would behave, that all went out the door instantaneously. And it wasn't like it took 20 years to change. It happened overnight. And you're left, kind of putting everything back together. So it's been challenging over the years. I never spoke about my near-death experience for about 6 or 7 years afterwards. There was 1 or 2 times I attempted to, and I only really went into like half the story, and I left out all the really good parts, and I just wasn't able to. So when I hear people saying they just don't speak about a traumatic event or something like that, I understand that fully. I physically could not discuss my NDE. Even now, it's still something I do not enjoy speaking about. It's not an easy topic to discuss, and there's always an emotion that comes out and feelings because of that. But I started speaking probably 7 years after. And there's 3 reasons why I speak about my near-death experience. One, I've realized it is healing and therapeutic for me to discuss and go into my story. And also, it's a way to give back to the community of other NDEers, experiencers, as well as individuals looking for peace and comfort that they can't find in more mainstream or traditional avenues. And to be able to provide that space and my story, if it can bring any level of peace or help to anyone, wherever, that's why I do it. And that's my way to give back. I don't question why I walked out there. I don't question what was told to me in my near-death experience. I didn't. I'm always asked what work is there? What is there to do? I don't know. I don't need it to be any more specific. I think, or I feel in the way I'm living, is that what I've learned from that was a sense of gratitude. I've learned a sense of grounding from that experience, overcoming, being resilient. The idea of giving back and being humanity first centered has been really powerful. And I look back on the entire experience, and it wasn't always amazing. It wasn't always this Oprah moment of, oh my God, it's wonderful and rainbows and love. It was hard. It was traumatic. If there was any way to die, I would not put suffocation in the top 10. It was violent. It was traumatic. It was frightening, especially when you match it with a food allergy where peanuts and tree nuts are in everything. And every time I eat out, I have to be cautious of food, and I have to be cautious of how it's prepared, and it's always around me. Someone eating peanut M&Ms next to me, one of those M&Ms, I'll be dead in under 2 hours. So it's something that I live with. I understand it's always there no matter what. And I've made peace as much as I can with that. And knowing that it's something that's always going to be an aspect of my life. But there's also an absolute blessing. You understand how fragile life is and how beautiful life can be. And when you are dying alone and suffocating to death on a hospital bed, what matters and what doesn't matter. And that is something you could be told what doesn't, but until you truly feel it, experience, and live it, it's a different understanding. So it's been an absolute blessing. I'm so fortunate that I survived without any permanent damage done from the lack of oxygen, that I made a full recovery, that I grew as an individual. I went through this process. I went through this continuing, even to this day, 11 and a half years later. And they say, oh, integration takes 7 years, 10 years. It seems like they always add more years on as time goes on, but it's an absolute lifetime of learning and growing and integrating. And at this point, I always think to myself, as being so fortunate to have been given a true second chance, what do you do with that? And where do you go from there? And then to couple that with a message from my grandfathers in that moment while I was crossing over, to then come back and say I had work to do. What does that mean? So 11 and a half years later, taking the knowledge and moment with my grandfathers during my near-death experience, I founded a nonprofit in the city I live in Florida. And we are one of the largest providers of social services, and we are a resource for low-income and homeless. And this was never something that I ever intended. It just happened, and we continued to grow and evolve, and we continue to do it day in and day out in service of the community. And we call ourselves a human first organization. And I like to think that it ties into, or I know in my heart that it ties into that night in April, 11 and a half years ago, of I have work to do. And this is my way to give back. I'm just here to wake up every day, to be fortunate, to be blessed, to be given a second opportunity, and be grateful that I have the privilege to give back to the community, and that I'm alive and well, and I'm grateful. And if I can make life better for anyone by speaking about my near-death experience or providing a service that wasn't provided before, I'm going to do that. And I'm sure that my grandfathers would be proud, and this is what I came back to do, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter what exactly it is, but I know I wake up every single day and I go to work, and my consciousness is, how do I help more people? Every day, day in and day out. We help one person, 10 people, it doesn't matter. We just keep going day in and day out to the best of our ability. And that's what I do. And if that's what came out of having a near-death experience, and that's what I was able to create and build a life and be of service to others, I'm all for that. I'm absolutely okay with that. I am so fortunate and grateful that I'm here.